But things like an inner monologue, do you have any sense on what the prevalence of that is? Because again, I think if you put a microphone in front of 100 people on the street and ask them the question, do you have an inner monologue? They'd all look at you like you're crazy, like that's a thing that everyone has. And people really don't realize that this is a specific thing that you can have or don't have. And it might be a lot less prevalent than people think.
So I think that so my translation of that question is people on the street, most of them 100%, 90%, a big number, think that everybody has an inner monologue all the time.
Yes.
That's true.
The actual
Most people think that. The actual prevalence of it, I think, is closer to 20%.
So you think from your research, 20% of people have an inner monologue?
Well, now you're asking more. I have to give a careful answer to that question too. Almost everybody has an inner monologue sometime. So when you have to remember a telephone number, you're saying, 70244 or whatever. Everybody has a inner monologue on those occasions. So you could say, well, 100% of the people have an inner monologue and or close to it, and that's probably true. How many people have an inner monologue almost all the time? That number, I think, is very small. I don't actually know the answer to that question, but I'm guessing 5%, 10%, 2%, somewhere down in there. There's a lot of reasons why I don't know the answer. My studies have not been anywhere close to cross-cultural enough, but that number is the number of people who actually talk to themselves, and by talk to themselves, string words one after another. They're silent, if that's what you mean by talking to yourself. The people who do that constantly or almost constantly, that's a very small number. But there's a lot of people who do that fairly frequently, 20% of the time, 50% of the time, 18% of the time, whatever. There's a lot of people like that, but by no means everybody.
Gotcha. So would you say that there's a normal distribution in the population of how much inner monologue people have? And some people have almost none. Most people have some quantity, which might be like 40% of the waking hours you're talking to yourself, or 30%. Would that be roughly appropriate for how it's kind of distributed in your research?
I'd agree with all of that, except I don't know anything about the word normal. If you took normal out of that, if you said there's a distribution and some people have 0 and some people have 100, I would have totally agreed with that. When you say normal distribution, then that means like there's a mean and standard deviation or whatever. And I'm not sure that's true. The distribution might very well be bimodal, for example.
Right.
But there's a chunk of people who have 10% and another chunk of people have 80% and not too many in the middle. I don't think that's true, but I don't have enough information to deny it.
Right.
So I don't know anything about the normality of the distribution. A variable distribution, that I would agree to.
Yes. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I was reading about a participant that you had in one of your studies on your website called Lena. And this was an individual who thought they had some sort of monologue, thought they had some inner speaking, but on careful sort of, interrogation, experience after experience, you kind of both figured out that she really did not have any active monologue at all. How did you go through that? Can you explain that sort of experience in how was it determined? How was it figured out? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, let me tell you the backstory of Lena. So 5 years ago now, or I can't remember exactly when, there was an internet kerfuffle, which there is every now and then, about inner monologue. It's sort of like your original question. People were saying, I've got inner monologue all the time, and other people say, no, I don't. And then you get into an argument, and some people cite Hurlburt and say, Hurlburt says, not everybody has an inner monologue, and nobody believes that, and whatever. One of those happened 4 or 5 years ago, and Lena came to me, and she said, your name's in the news here about, and I have an inner monologue all the time, but I don't, but you say, well, maybe I don't, and I'm interested in it. And I said to Lena, well, let's do this. Let's do the research that I kind of do, and let's do it out in the open, in the sense that we will put the interviews as they unfolded out on the web, so that everybody can see how Hurlburt arrives at this conclusion of people have inner monologue or they don't. And so we got some protections involved. So we wouldn't put these out live. We would delay them by a week or two so that Lena could think about whether she really wanted to have what she said about this particular experience forever memorialized on the web somewhere.
Right.
But then we released them sort of in real time as they occurred, unedited, so that people could judge for themselves. People who cared could judge for themselves whether I was talking Lena into stuff or whether she was a liar or whatever people want to do. We'd make the process as transparent as we could. So that's what the Lena studies came from. And yes, she did think she was a frequenter all the time inner monologue person. And I'd have to go back and look at what her actual samples were, but the sequence was pretty much like I described it to you earlier on. Her first day of sampling, she said, I was talking to myself. I had an inner monologue about this. And then I would ask what the details of that were. And she would say, well, I can't remember. And the next sampling day, she'd say, well, I was having an inner monologue about that. And I would ask about the details of that. And if she was using words, what those words were, and if she was using those words in a voice, what were the characteristics of the voice? Her voice, somebody else's voice, her voice in a monotone, her voice in a whisper, shouting voice, singing voice, whatever. I'm interested in those kinds of things. If your inner monologue is occurring, I would like to know the details about that. And then on the third or fourth day, she eventually said, I haven't been really having an inner monologue because I can't answer any of those questions. There's no voice, there's no words, there's no vocal characters.
Crazy.
But the important thing is that in no way did I try to talk her out of having an inner monologue. And on the contrary, I asked her to tell me about her inner monologue. I wanted to know what the words were that she was using and the voice was that she was using. I would be totally interested if she had an inner monologue. I wanted to know about the inner monologue. So she told me eventually, well, I don't have an inner monologue. It wasn't like I set out to influence her.
Right.
I set out to help her describe her inner experience in words that I could understand and that I could stand behind when I talk to you about them. I could use words that I thought that you would understand.
I believe I have an inner monologue. I don't think it's all the time. But I can say with at least a high degree of certainty, it might be a lower degree of certainty after this conversation, but at least coming into the conversation, I was fairly confident I had an inner monologue. And I'd be really curious to know how I would hold up to the questions that you would ask me about my experience sampling in a particular moment. How can somebody think they have an inner monologue but not have one?
Well, I'm going to speculate because I've talked to a lot of people about this, so I've got some opinions.
Speculate, go on. That's what podcasts are for.
Yeah. So what I think is that if you become interested in your inner experience for whatever reason, you ask yourself, well, what am I thinking about right now? And the answer, and the first thing is that when you're in that mode of asking yourself, what am I thinking right now? You're in a verbal mode. You are talking to yourself, asking you the question, quote, what am I thinking about right now? And so you have put yourself, your neural apparatus, whatever that means, which I don't really know, but you've put your neural apparatus into the verbal thing, into the verbal style, verbal whatever. And then when you look for something, you're likely to find something that's in words. And the other thing is the problem with this, what am I thinking about right now question, which I call armchair introspection. The problem is that there's one very clear thing that you're thinking about at that particular moment, and that is I'm asking myself the question, what am I thinking about right now? But that doesn't work. That's that you rule that out. I don't really care about that. And what I'm really interested in is what I was thinking about without asking myself the question. And that's a hard thing to do without a beep. So when you ask yourself the question, what am I thinking about right now? You've got nothing to look at because the only thing you've got looking at is this question that's in words. What am I thinking about right now? And so you think, well, if it wasn't that question, it would be another question similar to that. So it must have been in words. And I don't have any contrary evidence because every time I look, I am engaged in a verbal task. It's like refrigerator light from them. It seems like the refrigerator light's on all the time, but it's really only on when you open the door.
Right. So it's not that the people that don't have that monologue on can't, have this verbal mode within their mind. It's just that they don't default to it in their normal habitual, lifestyle. It's not their default mode to go to it, but it's not like aphantasia where they can't mentally visualize images. They can monologue and they can verbalize in their head. They just don't tend to without thinking about it. Would that be correct?
And that would be correct, except for the reference to aphantasia, because I think there haven't been any good studies or good enough by my standards studies so that people know what they're talking about aphantasia.
Interesting.
People say about aphantasia that my experience is such and such a way, but you have to. I don't trust people's retrospective reports about their own inner experience.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip and you're interested in learning more about our inner experience, because how could you not? It's just so damn fascinating. Then check out my full conversation with Dr. Russell Hurlbert here. It was incredible. 50 years of experience doing this. Insane. Watch it here. You will not regret it.